I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Welcome!
Hi! Welcome to Arcane Mark.
To GM Tools Framing Devices. Now, in most types of narratives, such as like a book or TV show, the only time when you need to use a framing device is it's a meta-narrative tool to tell, you're telling stories within stories, and like the play within a play in Hamlet, right? Yeah. That had all sorts of extra depth and nuance to it compared to the surface level. In a tabletop RPG, though, you're kind of using meta-narrative tools all the time.
So let's talk about what you mean by meta-narrative tools.
So, meta-narrative is, just like anything that starts with meta, the prefix meta comes from a misunderstanding of Aristotle's metaphysics, which came after his chapter on physics, so he was I don't really know what to call this. I'll just call it metaphysics, because it means it was the thing that came after physics in my book. And people were like, oh, he means it's like... It was about really deep stuff,
it's
so therefore
deep and abstract.
It's
and
deep
like
and it's on another level beyond. So meta must have meant that things are on another level beyond, and so now meta anything means like going being a level further or beyond on that. So meta narrative,
like how metagaming, you're like
metagaming.
You're using out of character knowledge. So give an example.
Or meta knight.
Yes, give an example of what would be like a meta narrative device.
Well, a story within a story is a meta-narrative device because it's a narrative within a narrative. But also just you can have meta-narrative devices if you have that aren't stories within stories. If you like characters who are genre savvy are kind of meta-narrative, where they're just like, no, you know what? Don't say you're about to retire.
Yes, because
after this one last battle.
So like if the characters behave in a way where they might be bringing in any sort of knowledge from the outside. And so, like, when you're playing in a tabletop RPG, there's always going to be some extent of that where the characters are going to be informed by things that you know about the way that world works, or about the way that RPG settings work and things.
And
like
because
that.
You're going back and forth with the GM and the players, you are in more need of using framing devices, even if you don't realize that you're doing it, even if you're not like creating a story within the story. So let's start by talking about ways that you might frame your tabletop RPG story without having a story within a story, and then we will peel back the layers and do the stories within stories.
So we can talk about things like, you mentioned like sort of genres. And the way that the way that you have those sorts of frames where it's like, this is a horror story. So then that means that there's certain assumptions that we're going to have about it, right? You're not going to bring the character who has, the abilities or personality traits or other things like that are not going to fit within that theme.
That's right. And when you set your frame of reference in a game, another reason that framing devices show up in tabletop RPGs is that, like, if you're writing a book or a TV show, chances are that it has one genre, but your game might be like, no, in this adventure, you went to Castle Creepy Pants, and it was super scary, and then in this next adventure, we're on the high seas, and then in this other one, there's political intrigue, and you can wind up, like, literally changing genres very quickly.
So you want to make sure that folks are, like, on the same page about what they're doing with the genre, because you can definitely wind up with frustration at the table if, like, someone thinks that they're in, like, a serious drama scene, and someone else thinks that they're in a comedy, and, like, one person is trying to, like, get into the emotions of the story, and the other person is trying to bring up, like, all sorts of wacky hijinks.
That's right. So one way that you can use a framing device that is not a story within a story to help set expectations and to keep people sort of focused on the current frame of reference is something we talked about in a way previous episode about victory points, where if you have a long-term victory point situation, that can be used as a framing device. So it's like, oh yeah, you have a rebellion and you're gaining rebellion points, and as that determines how your rebellion is going.
So then if the PCs are earning rebellion points, they know, like, they're going to be wanting to do actions that further the rebellion, or like, you know, if you have an event that's about like influencing people in a particular, like the nobles in a particular party toward a particular course of action, then you're earning influence points, and the players will know, okay, yeah, you know, if we do things that are just like, I'm gonna be a complete buffoon and I'm gonna insult people or whatever, that they're gonna lose points toward the overall goal.
And so in that way, having these points that carry over across what you're doing as the overall goal becomes a framing device for everything else that you have done. So like Linda said, the influence points can hurt or help your rebellion points.
Mm-hmm. Or like that, I was saying, the actions you can have it like that the points encourage actions that work toward the theme, so that people will be working together toward a common objective, and then that starts to set things. You can also help to set it with the way that you have NPCs respond to the player's behavior, and the way that you describe the scene itself.
That's right. And speaking of which, points as a sort of meta narrative tool, as a framing device, do not have to be aspirational. They could be something you're afraid of. There could be like a corruption points that you gain every time you do certain things, but that give you a power boost. And that is setting a framing device of sort of a gothic horror idea of like things are getting worse. Over time, things are transforming. They're getting out of control from their initial state and becoming something like that is more corrupt than before.
Yeah, I mean, points really are just tracking some feature of the story or the scene, or that is becoming greater or is becoming less.
Yes, exactly. So clocks in which are very similar to the victory point system in RPGs like Apocalypse World or Blades in the Dark are also a framing device. The framing device is, this is a clock. As it ticks around, when it hits 12, something bad or good will happen. It'll complete, and we now know it's a countdown, which maybe you can push it back a little bit by doing some things, but it's a countdown that frames what's happening. So as you can see, none of these is really the traditional use of framing device when you're writing a short story, but they are framing devices for your game.
And I mean XP too, like especially if you're doing an XP where you're not saying you get XP for everything, but you're doing like accomplishment and milestone XP, and then it's like, okay, you know, when you hit this specific point in the story, then all of the characters gain power, and then as characters gain power, the new types, then the theme and the types of stories that you're telling will change.
That's right. And so you want to think about what sorts of frames that you have sort of created for your game and for your players, and you may have unintentionally put up some frames just as you were running, even without thinking about framing devices. And they may be doing what you want them to do, and some of them may be going against what you want. So if you think very carefully about the frames that are in which your story is hanging, it will actually enhance your ability to like sort of promote the kind of activities and the kind of story that you are interested in seeing from the players and their characters. So, what are some other examples of frames of reference that can happen in a game?
So we've talked a little bit about sort of like stories within stories. Should we talk about that a little bit here and how that pertains to?
Sure. So, when we're talking about what the word framing device is usually used in other tradition, like traditional storytelling, it's used as a story within story, a play within a play, and some situation where you get encapsulated into something else. So the framing device, for example, of Tales of the Arabian Nights is mostly a bunch of adventure stories about Arabian mythology and folklore, but the framing device is that Scheherazade, the daughter of the vizier, is like the nth wife of this outrageously evil sultan who was like felt like he was betrayed by women, so he marries a wife and then kills her on their wedding night every day, or very often. But the clever daughter of the vizier has realized that if she tells a story and then when it's about to get to the good part, just stops and is like, tomorrow night we'll finish this one. And then always finishes and starts another story, then he won't murder her because he wants to hear the story. And then eventually he'll realize that she didn't betray him like he assumes everyone will do and not kill him overall. And so that becomes the framing device of Tales of the Arabian Nights. So when we talk about framing devices, it is the idea of having stories within stories, but particularly the framing device is the outer one, not the inner one in general. That's why we talked about the victory points that apply across your entire campaign as being the framing device. Or in the movie The Princess Bride, the framing device is that this grandfather is reading the book The Princess Bride to the grandson. Yeah.
When you do have stories within stories, you do still have that interaction where the characters are preparing to enter sort of that story within story frame. So, for example, like if your characters are going to be in a play, you have this section where they're like preparing to be in the play and figuring out how they're going to portray their role within the play and how that portrayal is going to impact whatever their other larger goals are.
Mm-hmm. So
Mark just put the poll in chat.
There's a few comments. So Kojo was saying that there was someone else talking about victory points too. It might have been Sly Strategist. And Rohit wonders, is gold actually a framing device for your game? So it usually isn't in the same way that XP is, because XP is a framing device for the hero's journey, and but gold can be, especially if your party are like merchants, or the acquisition of gold becomes a frame for everything else. You could have potentially a Monster of the Week story that was basically all about merchants trying to get money, and Boo Burn says the Arabian Nights is a Western name for something called 1001 Nights in West Asia.
A lot of the stories are not of Arabian origin, and the framing through Scheherazade is actually a Persian one. Just a heads up.
That's a good point.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, that's good to know. So, then we should say not 1001 Arabian Nights. We should say 1001 Nights then, to be more accurate about the Persian framing story. So, where were we? Yes, we were talking about the fact that gold is usually not a framing device, but could be if you're merchants and are just trying to get money. So, for example, you could consider in, I don't know, the anime Spice and Wolf, where he's just trying to get a lot of money as a merchant. Maybe gold and the money is part of the framing device, because if his money is doing worse, then it sort of drives the story and causes
I tend to think of it,
these episodic situations to
I tend to think it less as like, less like the granular, like, you know, I have 300 gold pieces versus 301 gold pieces, or I have like, you know, 99 XP versus, you know, 200 XP or whatever, but more in terms of like the states that are themselves fundamentally different. So like, you know, level 1 versus level 2 in the way that increases your character power, or like what you were saying there about like the characters being in a situation where they, you know, they're flush with resources and therefore they're going to do certain things, or they are short on resources and therefore their adventure is going to be about that goal of gaining resources.
And so, Rohit mentions framing devices are all over the place in Hindu mythology. For instance, in the Mahabharata, there's the story within a story within a story with many sub-stories. And that, the most famous, the Bhagavad Gita, where there's the whole, like, dialogue between Arjuna and Krishna about, like, his, Arjuna's role of what he's going to do, and going back and forth about philosophy, and it just, within the framing device of, you know, I have to fight against these people who I don't really want to fight, but it's like, but it's your warrior duty to fight against them. And so, yeah, absolutely. That's an example of a great example of a framing device. So framing devices are all over the place in real life and fiction. And so they work really well in games because they're good motivators too if people remember the framing device, and they can help you tie together a story even if you're in a more episodic nature of the story.
So let's talk about sort of how metagaming factors into this, because we're talking about, like, you know, out of character knowledge and out of character experience. Oh, is there something you wanted to check in the chat?
I was just looking for the poll things.
Oh, the poll things, yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested in talking about those metagaming.
So I think, you know, there's every table has like a different line in terms of like what do they consider to be metagaming versus not metagaming. You know, are you going to consider it to be metagaming if you have your character like, and one of the classic examples is like the skeleton, right? Like, is it metagaming to know that you should use a club instead of a pointy stick to attack something that's made of bones? Or, you know, what are the kinds of things that your group by general consensus says, yes, these are the kinds of things that characters know? And how do they also like handle player knowledge? Because sometimes you'll have groups that are like, okay, yeah, you know, unless it's dead obvious, like, you know, you're going to need to roll a recall knowledge check, or you're going to need to, like, have your character directly have experienced something on screen. And then you have other groups that are like, yeah, you know, whatever, just kind of bring your own personal knowledge into this, unless it's, like, something that's brand new and we haven't really dealt with before.
Right. And if you want more detailed advice on metagaming, then see our episode on GM Tools, specifically on metagaming as well.
Mm-hmm. But I think that's an important consideration too when you're considering the frame of the story, is how much is, where is that line between player knowledge and character knowledge? Where do you draw it? And that's going to make a big difference to how you portray things too.
So Kojo is wondering, because they're about to start jamming PF2 at some point, are adventure paths a good way to learn more about framing devices and how to construct a story? So adventure paths, the idea of an adventure path is in some way a framing device that contains the 6 volumes of the adventure path.
Or 3
volumes of the adventure path in a lot of the more recent adventure paths. 3 or 6 volumes, N volumes, 4 in one adventure path, or what have you. So an adventure path is, in a way, there can be the name of the adventure path. Like, Rise of the Rune Lords is a framing device around which Burnt Offerings and the Skinsaw Murders and all these other adventures down to Spires of Redemption Lost happen. However, if you want a Paizo adventure distribution mechanism that really has a pretty deep framing device around it, I would say that is organized
play, because you have the frame, because organized play has the frame of everyone is a member of the Pathfinder or Starfinder Society, and they're all going in, and they're all, you know, they have this starting point that everyone's assuming, and then you also have the sort of the organized play specific mechanics in the ways that those
you've got these factions and success mechanics, then the success mechanics send back reporting data which change the story. So it's very much the idea of the society as a framing mechanism. It's a framing device that is used to connect these otherwise disparate episodic adventures. You know, sometimes there's one meta story throughout the year that like a third or a quarter of the adventures are about, but a lot of the times the adventure will just be like, yeah, this is just whatever.
And another thing about Pathfinder Society and Starfinder Society is that they have to be designed so that like any character that you could conceive of and come up with like essentially the, okay, don't make them like antisocial or like really like nefarious in their behavior toward others to the point where, you know, to a ridiculous degree, like no evil characters or whatever. But beyond that, like, it has to be able to support any characters in any group. So it needed to be an organization that would just be like, okay, you know what? Whatever your character class, whatever your goals, whatever your background, as long as you can be someone who is willing to explore and report and cooperate back, as long, you know, you can work in a group toward a goal and receive money at the end and be cool with that, then you are a character who can be part of this journey.
That's right. So, like, if you want some examples of a episodic little adventures that have a big framing device, I would say that organized play is a good way to get at that.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, what is the next thing that we want to talk about in terms of meta narrative?
So I think one of the other you were talking a little bit before about like the rebellion, and I was thinking about like organizations and groups and factions and things like that that are beyond the PCs, that you're things that you're building up over time.
Mm-hmm. Those are absolutely a framing device. This bigger, broader organization, or this like whatever the victory point system stands for, the big, broad victory point system becomes a framing device upon which the entire story is told.
You can have something that's like, you know, a starship that like you're all riding aboard a giant starship and you're going off from that to do missions. Or you can have these sorts of things. It's like, you know, what happens in between the adventures that you're doing? What happens when you're in exploration mode, or or downtime, or what have you, in between the downtime was the word I was actually looking for there. Your downtime mode between the adventures, what are you going for? How much are these different stories all tied together?
That's right. So just because we were talking about framing devices all throughout this episode, you do not have to have framing devices, or at least not intentionally. Although already sitting down for a tabletop RPG is like there is also another framing device, which is a bunch of people, are at a table rolling dice, and
the rolls of those dice are going to determine.
Yes, and that is what is going into this story that's happening at the table. So there's already the real world framing device around everything you do. But you don't have to intentionally put in other framing devices, but you should be aware of which ones you're creating.
There's also the role of like out of character conversation in things too. You know, if a player's just like, you know, it would be funny if my character did this thing, but it's probably going to be disastrous, or like, you know, and then they communicate to the GM, yeah, you know, I'm cool with this thing being disastrous, and then like the fact that the player and the GM think that it would be interesting for a certain thing to happen, and then like it happens in the story for that reason, and like you have there's so much freedom in a tabletop RPG to take the story in so many different ways that like it's not like when you have like one author who's sitting down and writing something and is like, okay, yeah, you know, I'm gonna thread the story through and it's gonna work like this. You have a story that's gonna keep getting pulled by, you know, the interests of each individual person and by random chance to go into different directions that wouldn't necessarily have been expected by anyone else at the table.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And anytime you pull back that final frame and go to the actual people at the table, that's when you're going into the metagame, like Linda was talking about before. And it is true that, like, just as in the same way that a framing device can influence the things within their frame, like the corruption points or rebellion points not only can be earned throughout the campaign, they might also change what's happening moment to moment, because like, well, since your rebellion was so strong, this lord sides with you, and so that changes the adventure at this point. Or in the Princess Bride, when the grandfather's reading the story and the grandson's like, hold on, I don't want to hear about that part, and then they just kind of go out of it and skip back. In the same way, it is true that the framing device, the final framing device of your tabletop RPG, of you all sitting at the table, can have an impact. If like two players like get into a fight with each other or something like that, or and then that causes their characters to like suddenly not be working together.
Or like
as
what
well.
you were implying there about like how that is going to determine where you zoom in and where you zoom out. Like, do you have a campaign? Do you have players who are super interested in resource management and they want to focus on the nitty gritty, or do you have players who are just like, the idea of tracking their arrows and their provisions is like doing a tax form, and they just want to say, we spent enough money, we have enough, we don't want to look at this sort of thing, we want to focus on this part of the game.
That's right.
Or that part. And that has a big role as well.
Yep. So I would say that if you actually can like deftly manipulate framing devices and use them to improve your game, that's like a pretty high level GM skill, but at the bare minimum, figuring out which framing devices you may have accidentally been using or that may be affecting your game and what the effect is like more of the starter skill for that. The one that to start yourself out and start thinking about it is to ponder, what am I already doing that is a framing device?
So let's go back and summarize some of the frames we've been talking about here, because this is kind of like, it feels like we've been getting a little abstract in some places. We've been talking about sort of the frame of, you all are a group of people who are sitting around a table playing a game, and so you're bringing your own... Yeah, the metagame, that frame. We talked about the frames of different genres and the expectations that those bring.
XP as the hero's journey as a framing device.
And we also talked about victory point trackers and other broader trackers that show like certain things going up or going down, and how that influences the way that players act.
Yes, and Rohit had a question for us. How far do you think GMs should enforce the meta narrative during character creation? I know uncommon and rare options are meant for certain narratives only. What do you think of restricting common options? I know Paizo APs have suggested character options that fit the meta narrative. How strongly should they be enforced? I would say that you should definitely go for it on restricting common options if it makes sense. Unless it's like very distressing to a player because they were like, I'm only here for this particular common option.
Yeah. So like if you have like the commonality is based off of like sort of the default setting, the default, like, okay, yeah, you're in Golarion, you're probably somewhere in the Inner Sea.
The commonality allows Paizo to make APs where Paizo's not usually going to say you can't use this common thing, but you are not Paizo unless you are watching this, in which case, hi Paizo. But if you're not Paizo, then that means that you get to decide what's common in your setting or in this particular game. And so it's not even necessarily restricting common options. It could be just saying, well, this is actually uncommon in this game.
Yeah. It could be, for example, that you're in a setting where, you know, the gods are farther away, and so all divine magic is uncommon.
Yep.
And you'll want to think then about how, like, but if someone's like, well, you know, I really want to play a cleric, you know, what does that mean about their role in the setting? It could be that they are, like, you know, it's like, oh my gosh, you know, clerics aren't somebody that you're just going to find around easily, so this character is going to be someone of significance, and that's going to tie into their backstory. Because something being uncommon doesn't mean that the players can't have it. It generally means that, like, you'll want, if it's uncommon, you'll want to have some kind of story for why do they have it, and others don't necessarily all have it, and they're not, like, getting it at the corner market or what have you.
That's right.
And you know, for things like, especially for things like, you know, ancestries, where you're not going to, it's not like something that you're going to choose or acquire during the game. It might be like, oh, you know, this ancestry is a rare ancestry, you know, so you might have a story of like, you know, how, you know, are you originally from this particular area? Did you travel from an area where your ancestry is more common? You know, how has your experience been sort of shaped by that? If it's like, well, you know, most Shisk live in more insular communities in the Mwangi Expanse, and so like if you're a Shisk in Irisen, like, you know, how did you wind up in Irisen? Like, you know, did your parents or grandparents immigrate to Irisen? Did you decide that you were going to make that journey, and how has that shaped your experience?
Yeah, what are you even doing there?
Yeah. Why did you choose Irisen? Is it cold and dangerous? Yeah.
Absolutely. So, I think that or like, you know, if you have a particular magical tradition that is like, oh yeah, you know, this is a magical tradition that's usually from this region of the world, but I'm in this other region of the world, and I'm using these particular magical practices. Like, you know, is it because I attended a magic school where I learned that magical tradition? You know, how did you come about it? So I'd say, like, generally, yeah, having that story be of like, how did you get this thing that isn't easily available to everyone else? Mm-hmm. So I think we talked about framing devices, both in terms of the kind of ones that tabletop RPGs use just all the time without even realizing that you're using a framing device, and intentionally framing things in the 1001 Nights or Mahabharata style of framing, where there's extra layers and the added layer of you sitting at the table or on your favorite virtual tabletop being a framing device. All of these fit together and they create multiple layers of framing within a frame, within a frame, within a frame. And understanding that will help you level up as a game master and figure out what is certain effects that those meta narratives and framing devices are having on your game.
Yeah.
Do you think there's anything else for us to
I
cover?
think this is
just a shorter topic. I think so as well. So in that case, let's say goodbye to YouTube and then figure out what our next episode is. Bye, YouTube. See you next time.